It was a blistering summer morning in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Fulton County Courthouse was unusually packed. The hum of quiet conversations filled the room as individuals took their seats, waiting for a case that had stirred more curiosity than most. The hall was a mix of legal professionals, reporters, and spectators eager to witness what was about to unfold in this courtroom. The defendant? Savannah Kensington, a 24-year-old heiress known not just for her wealth, but for her reckless lifestyle and complete disregard for any rules or laws that didn't suit her fancy. This wasn't her first brush with trouble, but today's case had captured more than just the usual attention. While Savannah wasn't facing charges that could land her in prison for years, at least not this time, she had racked up multiple traffic violations, the most alarming of which was her reckless driving that nearly resulted in the death of an elderly man. The incident had occurred weeks ago when she sped through a crosswalk, narrowly missing Mr. Robert Harris, a 66-year-old retired veteran who had been on his way to a doctor's appointment. The shock of nearly being run over had caused Mr. Harris to lose his balance and fall, injuring his wrist. It was a serious enough case for the court to take notice, but one that most people would assume would be handled quietly and without much fuss. Little did anyone know, what should have been a straightforward hearing was about to escalate into something much more intense. At exactly 9:20 a.m., the courthouse doors swung open with a dramatic creak. Savannah Kensington entered the courtroom, late, unapologetic, and entirely unaware of the gravity of the situation. She was dressed like she was attending a VIP party or a high-profile gala, rather than a legal proceeding that would require any sense of decorum or seriousness. Her oversized sunglasses, towering stilettos, and an immaculately tailored, expensive designer suit made it clear that she believed the world revolved around her. The look of entitlement was palpable. Every step she took seemed calculated to draw attention, as if she were on the runway rather than in the midst of a legal battle. The occasional murmur from the crowd followed her as she made her way down the aisle, but Savannah didn't seem to notice. She moved with the self-assurance of someone who had always gotten away with everything, who believed the rules simply didn't apply to her. Trailing behind her was her lawyer, a nervous man in his mid-40s. His face was a mix of apprehension and regret, likely wondering what he had gotten himself into by agreeing to represent such a difficult client. He whispered something to Savannah as she made her way toward the bench, but she waved him off with a careless flick of her wrist, as if to say, "I know what I'm doing." As Savannah reached her seat, the entire courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Those present, from the professionals to the onlookers, turned their attention toward her. This wasn't just any case. This was the kind of case where an air of tension hung thick in the air. The moment she stepped into the room, the dynamic of the courtroom shifted. People exchanged sideways glances, unsure of what to expect. She was the last person anyone would want to see in this serious setting, but there she was, oozing an arrogance that seemed completely out of place. She paused in the center of the courtroom, seemingly unaware, or perhaps uninterested, in the people sitting behind her, all waiting for the proceedings to begin. With an exaggerated, almost theatrical gesture, Savannah motioned for her lawyer to move aside so she could set her oversized designer handbag on the bench beside her. The motion was casual, as though she were simply reserving a VIP table at an exclusive restaurant, rather than preparing for a judgment in a legal matter that had far-reaching consequences. Her handbag, a high-end piece with visible designer branding, rested on the bench with all the casualness of a woman who had everything and expected the world to move out of her way. And then, the air in the room changed. Judge Benjamin Carter entered, and it was as though the very atmosphere in the room shifted. At 54 years old, Judge Carter was a towering figure of authority. He wasn't the kind of judge who easily tolerated nonsense, nor did he cater to those who believed that the rules were for everyone but them. Known for his sharp mind, unwavering demeanor, and no-nonsense approach, Judge Carter had built a reputation for getting to the heart of the matter with precision and fairness. His presence in the room commanded immediate respect, and for anyone who was accustomed to treating the courtroom as a stage for their own personal drama, it was a reminder that this was a place of law and order. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and everyone in the courtroom stood in unison, a respectful gesture of deference to the judge. The murmur in the room quieted, and all eyes turned to Judge Carter, whose stoic expression gave nothing away. His gaze swept over the room, making it clear that today would be a day that would test some people's attitudes. Everyone rose except Savannah, who hesitated for just a beat. There was no immediate rush, no sense of urgency, and certainly no hint of respect for the proceedings. She sighed dramatically, her lips curling into a slight smirk, before finally standing up with an exaggerated slow motion. It was as if she were doing everyone a favor by acknowledging Judge Carter's presence, though her demeanor suggested she was mostly annoyed at having to conform to any expectations at all. Judge Carter, however, didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses, opened the case file in front of him, and without so much as a pause, began speaking in a calm, professional tone. There was no need for theatrics on his part. His mere presence was enough to set the tone for what was to come. What should have been a quick and simple case, one that was well within the realm of routine traffic violations, was about to take a turn no one in that courtroom expected. As Judge Carter continued reading through the charges, Savannah leaned back in her seat with a haughty air, crossing her arms defiantly. Her posture spoke volumes. She was relaxed, unconcerned, and completely disinterested in the proceedings that were about to shape her future. Her legs were stretched out beneath the table, her foot tapping lazily to some beat that only she could hear, while her eyes scanned the room as though she were bored out of her mind. She rolled her eyes exaggeratedly as Judge Carter described her reckless driving, focusing on the incident where she had nearly run over a pedestrian in a crosswalk. The seriousness of the situation appeared to have no effect on her, and the severity of her actions was lost on her entirely. It was as though she couldn't fathom why anyone would care about such a trivial matter. Judge Carter, however, was undeterred by her display of indifference. He continued reading from the case file, his voice steady, calmly outlining the details of her reckless driving, how she had been speeding through the city streets, oblivious to the crosswalks, and how she had narrowly missed hitting Mr. Robert Heiress, a retired veteran, as he walked across the road. She had accelerated toward him without any regard for his safety, her only concern being her own convenience. The judge spoke without emotion, his voice methodical and firm as he described how Heiress had fallen to the ground and sustained a wrist injury that required medical attention. He had been terrified, confused, and shaken by the incident. It was only through sheer luck that Heiress hadn't been seriously harmed, or worse, killed. Savannah, for her part, wasn't paying attention. Instead, she began tapping her nails against the table, her fingers clicking against the wood in a rhythmic pattern. The sound echoed through the courtroom, loud enough for everyone to hear. Each tap seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if she were sending a clear message that she had no respect for what was happening. The tap-tap-tap of her nails was a blatant distraction to everyone around her, but Savannah didn't seem to care. It was almost as though she enjoyed the tension she was creating, the discomfort she was causing in the room. Her lawyer, who had been visibly sweating since they entered the courtroom, leaned in close to her, whispering urgently under his breath. His face was etched with anxiety, his brows furrowed in concern. He likely realized that Savannah's behavior was undermining her case and was urging her to show some respect for the proceedings, to take the situation more seriously. But Savannah, not even bothering to turn her head, waved him off dismissively with a flick of her hand. The gesture was casual, dismissive, as though she was telling him to relax, that everything would be fine. She wasn't worried. She had always been able to charm her way out of trouble before. It was at this moment that the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Judge Carter, who had remained unfazed by her antics up until this point, looked up from his case file. His gaze shifted toward her, and his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer than before. His expression remained calm, but there was a sense of quiet authority in the way he stared at her. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice calm but laced with an edge of warning, "I need you to confirm your identity." Savannah barely glanced up at him. She had been half listening to the judge's words, but the moment his gaze met hers, she knew this wasn't going to be as simple as she had hoped. She sighed dramatically, as if she were being asked to do something terribly inconvenient. Then, without bothering to sit up straight or make eye contact, she muttered in a bored tone, "Yeah, that's me." The words were barely audible, and there was no respect in them, just an indifferent, almost dismissive response. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, a subtle wave of shock at her attitude. The people in the courtroom were growing uncomfortable with her behavior, but no one dared to speak out. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how this would play out. Judge Carter's eyes remained fixed on her, but his expression didn't change. He had heard her words, but his calm demeanor remained unshaken. There was a slight narrowing of his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of her disrespect, but it wasn't enough to provoke a reaction. Instead, he continued in the same measured, professional tone. "Ms. Kensington," he said, his voice steady, "this courtroom adheres to a certain level of decorum. I strongly suggest you adjust your tone." Savannah, seemingly oblivious to the severity of the situation, smirked. She twirled a piece of her perfectly styled blonde hair around her finger, her nails shining brightly as she absent-mindedly spun the strands of her hair. Her smirk was as arrogant as ever, a clear signal that she wasn't taking this seriously at all. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The words were laced with mockery, as though she were amused by the entire proceedings. A few gasps echoed throughout the room, as the people watching her began to sense the magnitude of her disrespect. Even her lawyer, who had been desperately trying to keep a low profile, buried his face in his hands in embarrassment. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the reality of the situation settling in. He was powerless to control her, and it seemed he had long since lost the battle to rein in her behavior. Judge Carter, however, remained unfazed. His posture didn't change, and his expression remained composed. If anything, his eyes grew a little colder, his patience wearing thin. "Ms. Kensington," he continued, his voice still firm but controlled, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Savannah rolled her eyes again, as if the question itself were beneath her. She exhaled loudly, making it clear that she was uninterested in what the judge had to say. "Honestly, no," she said, her voice laced with irritation. "It's just some stupid parking tickets and some guy who freaked out because I hit the gas too hard. This is a waste of everyone's time." The courtroom fell into a deep silence. Everyone could feel the weight of her words, the careless disregard for the law, the victim, and the process. It was as if she had no concept of the seriousness of the charges against her. And yet, despite her defiant attitude, she had just alienated everyone in the room. Judge Carter slowly closed her file, his fingers deliberate as he placed it on the bench beside him. He took off his glasses and placed them down carefully as well, as if preparing for something. The silence in the room grew even more intense, as everyone awaited his next move. With a calm but powerful voice, Judge Carter spoke again, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Miss Kensington, I strongly suggest you choose your next words carefully." For the first time in the entire proceedings, Savannah looked slightly uneasy. She shifted in her seat, her posture becoming less confident, but rather than backing down, she simply shrugged again, as if to show she wasn't intimidated. "What? It's not like I actually hit the guy," she scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. Judge Carter sat back in his chair, his gaze unwavering and unyielding. The room was filled with the hushed silence of a tense courtroom, and every person present could feel the weight of the moment. His eyes locked onto Savannah, his expression calm, but his presence alone commanded respect. He was a man of discipline, a man who didn't suffer fools lightly. This was a battle of wills, and it was clear that the judge was determined to win. "You think this is ridiculous, Miss Kensington?" he asked, his voice controlled but piercing, the words laced with an undeniable firmness. It was a question that demanded an answer, but more importantly, it was a challenge to Savannah's arrogance, to her casual disregard for the law. Savannah scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she leaned back even further in her chair, completely undeterred by the judge's words. Her body language screamed disdain and defiance. She had been through this before. She was used to getting what she wanted, used to being in control, and she certainly wasn't about to back down now. "Yeah, I do," she said with a dismissive shrug, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's not like I robbed a bank. This whole thing is just over-the-top drama. I mean, really, who cares about some parking tickets and a guy who got a little freaked out?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, but they only served to fuel the judge's growing impatience. Judge Carter didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly, almost as if he were considering her words. but his expression remained impassive, unaffected by her insolence. He folded his hands neatly in front of him, the motion deliberate, as though preparing to deliver a final, crushing blow. "I see," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Allow me to clarify something for you." The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone in the courtroom leaned forward slightly, eager to hear what the judge would say next. It was clear that whatever was coming next was going to change everything. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, and even Savannah could feel the shift. She might have thought this was all a joke, but now there was a hint of doubt creeping into her mind. "The charges against you," Judge Carter continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore, "include not only reckless driving, but also endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not judge the size of the crime, but rather its impact." Savannah rolled her eyes again, completely unfazed, as she muttered under her breath in a tone that made it clear she thought the entire thing was a waste of time. Yeah, whatever," she said dismissively, as though she was already mentally checking out of the situation. Judge Carter's expression didn't change. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react in anger. Instead, he took a deep breath and calmly picked up a document from the bench. He flipped through the pages with precision, taking his time as he prepared to make his point. The audience, who had been quietly watching the back and forth, now felt the tension rise. "Let the record show," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with unwavering clarity, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Robert Heiress, a 66-year-old retired veteran, was legally crossing the street when Ms. Kensington accelerated toward him, causing him to fall and sustain an injury to his wrist. He has since required medical treatment and experiences ongoing pain." Savannah's smirk, which had been firmly in place since the beginning of the hearing, faltered. For the first time, she seemed taken aback. Her eyes darted to her lawyer, who was now visibly sweating, his face a picture of anxiety. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, but Savannah, ever the picture of denial, quickly dismissed it. She waved her hand dismissively at the judge's words. "I didn't hit him," she mumbled, her voice tinged with annoyance. "He's fine. It's just a little scrape or something. He's probably overreacting." But her confidence was beginning to crack. Her casual dismissal was no longer as convincing as it had been when she first entered the room. Judge Carter, however, was unfazed. He had dealt with people like Savannah before. People who believed that their wealth, status, and entitlement could shield them from the consequences of their actions. Judge Carter's tone sharpened, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to make it clear that he was no longer willing to tolerate her arrogance. "Ms. Kensington," he said, his voice cool but forceful, "does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Savannah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but instead of acknowledging the gravity of the situation, she simply huffed in disbelief. She was still trying to play the situation down, still trying to convince herself that this was just another insignificant incident. And then, Judge Carter delivered the final blow. "Because Mr. Heiress is here today," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. The courtroom went dead silent. The realization of what had just been said settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. There was no escaping the truth now. In the second row, Mr. Heiress sat quietly, his arm in a sling, his expression calm but filled with an air of quiet disappointment. He had listened to every word, every mocking comment that Savannah had made, and he was finally facing her, looking at the woman who had so carelessly endangered his life. His face betrayed no anger, only the solemnity of someone who had been deeply affected by the actions of another. For the first time in the entire hearing, Savannah looked genuinely uncomfortable. Her confidence wavered, her smirk fading away. She glanced over at her lawyer again, but this time, there was no dismissing him with a wave of her hand. Her eyes were wide, and the reality of the situation was finally starting to hit her. The finality of the moment was undeniable. This wasn't just a case about speeding or a minor accident. This was about a life, a person who had been hurt by her carelessness. And now, as the entire courtroom waited for her response, Savannah was forced to confront the true impact of her actions. Judge Carter's next words left the entire courtroom stunned, creating a wave of shock that rippled through the room. His voice, calm but filled with undeniable authority, rang out, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. Since you seem unconcerned with consequences, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand. Savannah's eyes widened, her body stiffening as the realization of what had just been said sank in. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time that morning, she found herself at a loss for words. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs and the occasional rustling, became eerily silent as all eyes turned to her. Judge Carter didn't allow her any time to respond. He was not here to negotiate or debate. His words were a proclamation, and the weight of them was heavy in the air. Along with fines and 200 hours of community service, Judge Carter continued, his voice unwavering. You will spend 30 days volunteering at a homeless shelter. The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning sinking in slowly. Savannah blinked, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. She had always been able to weasel her way out of situations, always been able to use her status and wealth to shield herself from consequences. But now, everything had changed. This wasn't a fine she could pay to make it go away. This wasn't a simple slap on the wrist. The judge had just sentenced her to something that would truly make her face the real world, the world outside of her bubble of privilege. Judge Carter's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes cold and unyielding. He wasn't offering any comfort, any easy escape. His voice rang out again, this time with a touch of finality. You will meet people, he said, his words steady but powerful, who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then, you'll understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement. Savannah's lips parted, but no sound escaped. The words, spoken with such clarity, struck her harder than anything else that had happened so far in this courtroom. She had spent her entire life insulated from the harsh realities of the world, shielded by her wealth and status. The thought of spending 30 days in a homeless shelter, facing those she had long dismissed as beneath her, was a shocking concept. She had never been forced to confront her own privilege before, and now it was happening in the most public way possible. The room buzzed with murmurs of disbelief. The spectators, the reporters, and even her lawyer were shocked by the severity of the sentence. They had all anticipated a fine, maybe some community service, but none of them could have predicted this. It was clear that Judge Carter was making an example out of Savannah, not just for her, but for everyone in that courtroom who might have thought that wealth and status could allow them to escape responsibility. Savannah sat frozen in her seat, her body rigid as she processed what was happening. She tried to speak, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was a blur, and for the first time, she didn't know how to respond. All her usual confidence, her ability to charm and manipulate, seemed completely useless in the face of such a firm and just sentence. She had no retort, no sarcastic comeback. Instead, all she could do was sit there, wide-eyed and speechless. "This is insane," she whispered, the words barely audible as she looked at her lawyer for some kind of help. But her lawyer, as uncomfortable as ever, simply looked away, unable to assist her this time. He had never imagined that the case would escalate like this. He had expected a fine, a reprimand, maybe a mild sentence, anything to make the situation go away. But Judge Carter had delivered something much more significant, something that Savannah would remember for the rest of her life. The courtroom remained eerily quiet, every single person waiting for the next move. Some people exchanged glances, others shook their heads in disbelief. But all of them knew that what had just transpired was a powerful reminder of what true justice meant. Savannah Kensington, the wealthy, entitled heiress who had thought she could get away with anything, was finally being forced to face the consequences of her actions. Judge Carter remained unfazed by the turmoil his words had caused. He had seen people like Savannah before, people who had lived their lives in a bubble, oblivious to the struggles of others. But now, he had delivered a sentence that would make her understand what it meant to live without privilege, to be faced with the harsh realities that so many others faced every single day. "This is justice," Judge Carter said, his voice calm but resolute. There was no anger in his tone, no need for it. His words alone had made the point loud and clear. This was the law. This was fairness. Savannah, still in a state of shock, sat motionless in her seat. Her hands were clenched in fists on her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She was no longer the confident, untouchable heiress who had walked into this courtroom with a smirk on her face. Now, she was just a woman who had been humbled, forced to confront the consequences of her actions in the most profound way possible. For the first time in her life, Savannah was truly powerless, and it was a feeling she would never forget.